Hi, my name's Carlene Goldthwaite, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be talking with you about great volunteer management tools that work, and this is an excerpt from a longer program that I was pleased to do on behalf of the Western Slope Rural Philanthropy Days. So let me just jump right in. We all know the value of volunteerism, that many of our organizations would not be able to survive and would not be able to serve our communities without a cadre of volunteers. That said, volunteer management is becoming a very highly skilled art. And so in this brief excerpt, we're going to talk about the life cycle of a volunteer. How do you find them? How do you keep them engaged? How do you address performance if things aren't going well? And how do you recognize and reward your volunteers? So let's talk first about how do you find them. One of the tools for your toolbox is to think very critically about where your potential volunteers will hear your message. It may be through a newspaper advertisement, it may be through radio connection, it may be through networking with your board members and your existing volunteers and existing staff, reaching out into the community. Other resources that you can look at to get the word out about your volunteer opportunities include fraternal organizations, religious organizations, educational organizations, and professional associations. A good volunteer recruitment strategy is going to give you an opportunity to use all of those to get the word out about the kind of volunteers you're looking for and the skills that you're going to need. Another really untapped source of potential volunteers would be to piggyback on any signature events that your organization sponsors. When you have a signature event, there typically will be an opportunity for people to donate money to your organization. What about finding a way so that you can make your volunteer opportunities just as well known? So work with your public relations and your marketing people to find out ways that you can partner and get the word out to a larger group of people that you might not ordinarily reach. Now, as you're doing that outreach, a couple of really important things to remember are to be very specific about what you're looking for, what kinds of volunteers, what sorts of skills, and what kind of work they'd be doing. You want to ensure that any messaging that you put out is consistent with other branding from your organization. If your company is big enough to have a human resources strategy, you'll want to piggyback that with your volunteer strategy. If there are logos that are used for your organization, if there is a certain template for designing flyers and those sorts of things, you'll want to piggyback with that and partner with those folks so that A, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and B, when people in the community see information about your organization, they see a message that is very, very consistent. It's also helpful sometimes to find a way to have a presence on the website of your organization if you don't already. For me as a volunteer to be able to go to your website, click a tab that says volunteers, and then learn whatever's going on, all the new stuff with the volunteers and what new opportunities are out there, that says something to me. It sends a strong message about your valuing volunteers. It also provides a really nice clearinghouse for you to be able to disseminate a lot of information very quickly to your volunteers. The other thing to think about in terms of recruitment and selection is to plan for succession. In other words, if you have a volunteer who perhaps has a very specialized skill set, you'll want to have some strategy in place to replace that skill set when that person moves on to something else or decides to leave your organization. So think ahead of time about where we would find someone with that specialized skill set. Okay, so now you've got them on board, what happens? The onboarding and welcome process is really critical to continuing that engagement with the volunteer. They're volunteering because they have a heart for your mission. They're volunteering because they believe that you make a difference and they want to be part of that positive difference in the community. When I come into your organization as a volunteer, a special welcome is something that means a lot to me. A special welcome can be anything from a handwritten "We're glad you're here" card to a little basket of candy that we give them. Perhaps your executive director or the chairman of your board makes one phone call to a person and says, "Hey, I hear you've joined us. Thank you very much for doing that. I've found this really fulfilling and I hope you do too." Anything that you do, any small gesture that you do that helps that volunteer feel special and connected and valued goes a long way to a long-term retention of that particular volunteer. When they come on board, you'll want to do an orientation and training process with them. And again, if your organization is large enough to have a human resource or a training function for your paid staff, there may be components of that process that you can adapt or you can piggyback onto or you can include volunteers in that, again, means that you don't have to recreate the wheel, and that ensures that your volunteers are hearing the same kind of message that your paid staff is hearing. In some of your organizations, there are ongoing training requirements based on the kind of work that your volunteers do. Please be very clear when you are recruiting those volunteers about those training requirements and any other requirements that they're going to be subjected to or they're going to be expected to perform. Sometimes when we recruit volunteers, we're not really clear about the amount of time that's going to be needed or other aspects of the particular role, and that does end up coming back to bite us further down the road. So be as specific as you can and make your training as specific as you can. On the website, you will see the handout for this particular workshop, and you'll see on a page that's entitled "Engaging" a number of different ideas for things that you would want to include in your onboarding, orientation, and training process for folks. Please know this is not an exhaustive list, and nor is it the perfect list. Pick and choose what works for you and your organization, and don't be afraid to borrow some best practices from your nonprofit down the road. It's very important to confirm the understanding of expectations, and also extremely important to educate your volunteers on how they get help if they need help with something. So if I'm a new volunteer, and I've noticed that some folks on my shift do things differently than other folks, whom do I ask that question of? Because I want to make sure I'm doing things correctly. And perhaps other volunteers have adapted some shortcuts that are not as effective as the way you trained me to do it. So who do I go to with those kinds of questions? If I have an idea about how to make something work better and more effectively, how would I go with that idea? So that's the onboarding and training part. The part that most folks are most interested in is managing performance, particularly managing non-performing volunteers. That's a very deep subject, and there are a lot of resources online for how to do that. In the handout, again, there are some bullet points about how you can handle those difficult conversations. I'm a big believer in practice. I'm a big believer in rehearsing this difficult conversation with someone who will give me feedback and someone I trust who can say, "I don't think that's the best way for you to phrase that. Could you do it differently?" And so don't hesitate to tap into a trusted peer to help you with that. There are scads of ways to recognize volunteers. Many of them don't cost any money, which is good for us in the nonprofit world. Some of which cost a little bit of money, but are very doable within our budgets. Again, in your handout, there's a whole page of different ways that you can recognize volunteers and say thank you to them. Along with the handout for this workshop, we've also posted a page of resources that you can tap into as a volunteer coordinator so that you can see what other folks are doing out there and maybe adapt some of their best practices. And there's also a document on the website that talks about using paid staff also in volunteer roles, because there are some legal and fiduciary things that you need to pay attention to when you're making those decisions. In short, volunteer management is not an easy thing to do. It becomes more complex every day. And I hope that the information that you got from this little segment and from the handouts online will help you be the best volunteer manager you can be. Thank you so much for your time.